The humid air clung to Michael Donovan's skin as he walked through downtown Philadelphia's financial district, sweat beading along his temples despite the early morning hour. The smell of hot asphalt mingled with food cart aromas and the cacophony of street vendors hawking their wares. He wore faded jeans, a plain cotton t-shirt, a worn backpack, and a dark baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. No one looked twice at him. He blended perfectly with the countless workers heading to their jobs, another faceless commuter in the urban landscape. This was exactly how Michael wanted it. The truth was far different from appearances. The unassuming man navigating the cracked sidewalks owned many of the buildings that towered around him. Michael Donovan, founder and CEO of Keystone Development Group, controlled a vast real estate empire worth billions. Office buildings, shopping centers, and luxury apartments spread across 3 states. His company employed thousands, and his decisions affected countless lives, yet few knew his face. He never attended ribbon-cutting ceremonies. His name appeared on legal documents and annual reports, but he remained a ghost, represented by a team of polished executives who served as the public face of his empire. Even within his company, only a handful of executives ever met with him directly. For nearly 15 years, Michael had cultivated this intentional invisibility, building walls between himself and the world. Lately, however, something had changed. A persistent emptiness had settled in his chest, an ache that his sprawling penthouse and extensive art collection couldn't soothe. The people who surrounded him daily, assistants, lawyers, investment advisors, treated him with the careful deference reserved for someone who could fire them with a word. There were no genuine connections, no one who saw beyond his wealth. And so Michael had started these walks several months ago, shedding his tailored suits and security detail to move anonymously through the city he owned piece by piece. He found a strange comfort in being overlooked, in experiencing the raw reality of urban life without the buffer his wealth typically provided. He'd pass homeless people who didn't reach out to him for money, because in his current attire, he looked like he had none to spare. He'd overhear genuine conversations, witness small kindnesses between strangers, and sometimes catch glimpses of authentic human connection that seemed increasingly rare in his insulated world. This morning, Michael paused near Franklin Plaza, one of his company's more recent acquisitions. The gleaming glass structure housed high-end retail on the lower levels and premium office space above. He watched as employees scurried through the revolving doors, many wearing identification badges bearing his company's logo. None of them would recognize the rumpled man observing from across the street. His attention shifted to a small group gathered near the side entrance, children selling candy and small trinkets to passers-by. Most looked to be between 10 and 12 years old, with worn clothes and tired eyes that belonged to much older souls. Michael had seen them before, or others like them during his secret walks. Today, something made him linger longer than usual. A girl stood slightly apart from the others. Thin, with sun-darkened skin and piercing eyes, she didn't call out to potential customers like her companions. Instead, she watched people intently as if studying them. Something about her struck Michael as familiar, though he couldn't place where he might have seen her before. As he observed, a businessman in an expensive suit brushed past the children, accidentally knocking a box of candy from one boy's hands. The man continued without pausing, talking loudly into his phone. The scattered candies were quickly lost to the dirty sidewalk. Michael watched as the quiet girl moved swiftly to help the boy gather what could be salvaged. The small act of kindness amid indifference resonated with something inside him. Without thinking, Michael crossed the street. He approached the children, who immediately turned to him with practiced sales pitches. "Candy bar, mister? Only $2. Keychains handmade, just $5. Michael smiled politely but focused on the quiet girl, who was now watching him with unusual intensity. Something flickered in her expression. Recognition? That wasn't possible. He'd never spoken to these children before. "Would you like to buy something?" she finally asked, her voice surprisingly steady and clear. "Actually, I was wondering if you'd all like something to eat," Michael replied, gesturing to a cafe across the street. "I was about to grab some breakfast." The other children looked uncertain, exchanging glances that spoke volumes about learned distrust of adult strangers. But the girl held Michael's gaze, her head tilted slightly as if trying to solve a puzzle. "Why?" she asked simply. The directness caught Michael off guard. In his normal life, no one ever questioned his motives so bluntly. "Because it looks like you've been out here a while, and I thought you might be hungry," he answered honestly. "Unless you're not allowed to leave this spot." The girl considered him for another long moment before turning to the others. "It's okay. I know him." The word sent an inexplicable chill down Michael's spine. Know him? That wasn't possible. The other children seemed to accept her assessment, though, and minutes later, Michael found himself seated at a corner table with 5 children demolishing plates of eggs, pancakes, and hash browns. He learned their names. The quiet girl was Amy, and she appeared to be a protective figure for the younger ones. Jason, Zoe, Marcus, and Dylan. They lived at Hope House, a shelter for families experiencing housing insecurity, they explained between bites. They sold candy to help their families with expenses the shelter couldn't cover. Michael listened more than he spoke, absorbing their matter-of-fact descriptions of lives so different from his own. Throughout the meal, he noticed Amy watching him with that same searching look. When the younger children became distracted with the cafe's small arcade games, Michael finally addressed her directly. "Earlier you said you know me. Have we met before?" Amy wiped her mouth with a napkin, her movements deliberate. "You don't remember, do you?" she asked. 3 months ago, by the overpass on Market Street." Michael frowned, searching his memory. He had taken many walks over the past months, exploring different areas of the city. Market Street, the overpass? Something tugged at his recollection. A cold night, an impulsive decision. "There was a woman," Amy continued, her voice growing softer. "She was lying on cardboard under the bridge. You stopped. You thought no one was watching, but I was." The memory suddenly crystallized. On a particularly cold night, Michael had passed a woman huddled under the overpass, covered only with plastic bags against the bitter wind. He had stopped, removed a thick blanket from his backpack, one he'd brought for just such a purpose, and left it beside her along with a paper bag containing food he'd purchased earlier. The woman had appeared to be sleeping, and he'd slipped away without waking her, without speaking a word. "That was your—" he began, the question trailing off. "My mom," Amy said, meeting his eyes directly. "She's at Pennsylvania Memorial now. She got really sick after that night. The doctors don't think she'll—" Amy stopped, swallowing hard. But before she went to the hospital, she told me about you. She said, "That man looked at me like I was still a person. I never forgot your face." Michael felt something shift inside him, a fault line cracking through carefully constructed walls. He had never intended to be seen that night. It had been one small gesture among many during his anonymous walks, a drop in an ocean of need he knew he could never fully address. Yet somehow, this child had not only witnessed his moment of humanity, but had carried the memory, recognized him despite his disguise. "I didn't do much," he said finally, his voice rough. Amy shook her head. "You stopped." "Nobody stops." The simplicity of her statement hit Michael with unexpected force. In that moment, surrounded by the morning clatter of the cafe and the distant sounds of arcade games, something fundamental changed in Michael Donovan's carefully ordered world. He had spent years building barriers between himself and genuine human connection, yet had been profoundly seen by a child who had every reason to be invisible herself. Amy reached into her pocket and pulled out a smooth stone with the letter M drawn on it in marker. "Mom gave me this before they took her to the hospital. Said when I saw you again I should show you and tell you I was still here." Michael stared at the stone, then back at Amy's face. For the first time in years, he felt truly visible, not as a wealthy man, not as a powerful CEO, but simply as a human being whose small act of kindness had mattered. And in that visibility, he found something he hadn't realized he'd been searching for. The following day, Michael sat in his corner office on the 32nd floor of Keystone Tower, staring out at the Philadelphia skyline. The panoramic view had once filled him with pride, concrete evidence of all he had built from nothing. Today, it felt like looking at a diorama, a miniature world he could observe but not truly touch. His executive assistant, Rebecca, had placed a stack of contracts on his desk an hour ago. They remained untouched. Instead, Michael's thoughts kept returning to Amy and the stone with the letter M etched upon it. The letter didn't stand for Michael, he'd learned. It stood for miracle. That's what Amy's mother, Elizabeth Foster, had called the unexpected kindness from a stranger on a freezing night. A miracle. The word felt too grand for the simple act of leaving a blanket and food. Yet the memory of Amy's steady gaze as she told him how her mother had spoken of him, "That man looked at me like I was still a person," continued to reverberate through him. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. Rebecca stood in the doorway, her professionally concerned expression perfectly calibrated after 7 years as his assistant. "Mr. Donovan, the board members are waiting in the conference room. The quarterly meeting was scheduled to begin 15 minutes ago." Michael nodded absently. "Tell them I'll be there shortly." Instead of leaving, Rebecca hesitated. This was unusual enough that Michael turned to look at her directly. "Is everything all right, sir? You've seemed distracted since yesterday afternoon." Michael almost gave his standard response, a polite dismissal, a reminder of boundaries between employer and employee, but something stopped him. "Rebecca, how long have you worked for me?" 7 years and 4 months, sir." "And in that time have I ever asked about your family?" Rebecca blinked, clearly surprised by the question. No, sir, not directly. But you have one, a family." It wasn't a question, but Rebecca answered anyway. "Yes, my husband David and our daughter Sophie. She's 6 now." 6 years. Rebecca had worked for him while raising a child, and he had never once inquired about her, had never seen a picture of the girl, or asked how her first day of school had gone, or if she'd lost any teeth yet. These normal human curiosities had seemed extraneous to their professional relationship. Now they felt like glaring omissions. "Sophie, that's a lovely name," he said finally. Rebecca's expression softened slightly. "Thank you, sir. She was named after my grandmother." Another beat of silence passed. "The board, sir?" "Yes, of course." Michael stood, straightening his tie. "Tell them I'll be right in." As Rebecca turned to leave, Michael added, "And Rebecca, perhaps you could bring a photo of Sophie tomorrow. I'd like to see who's been stealing your attention from my paperwork all these years." The smile that bloomed across his assistant's face was genuine, unguarded, something rare in his corporate world of calculated expressions. After the board meeting, which he navigated on autopilot, Michael cancelled his afternoon appointments and changed into the clothes he kept in his private bathroom for his anonymous walks. 20 minutes later, he stood outside Pennsylvania Memorial Hospital, gathering his courage. He had spent the morning making discreet inquiries, using his considerable influence to locate Elizabeth Foster and learn about her condition. The prognosis wasn't good. Advanced pneumonia, complicated by years of malnutrition and untreated chronic conditions. She drifted in and out of consciousness, and the doctors weren't optimistic about recovery. Now Michael hesitated at the hospital entrance. What was he doing here? What could he possibly say to this woman? Before he could retreat, a familiar voice called out from the hospital garden. "You came." Amy sat on a bench near a small fountain, a book open on her lap. The evening sun caught her face, highlighting cheekbones too pronounced for a child her age. Michael approached slowly, feeling oddly nervous. "I wanted to check on your mother. How is she today?" Amy's face fell slightly. "The same. She wakes up sometimes, but she doesn't always know where she is." She closed her book. "They don't think she's going to get better." The blunt assessment, delivered in a child's voice with an adult's resignation, struck Michael like a physical blow. "I'm sorry," he said, the words feeling wholly inadequate. Amy shrugged, a gesture that tried to convey indifference but couldn't quite mask the pain beneath. "We've been at Hope House for almost a year. Before that, we stayed with Mom's friend until they got evicted. Before that..." She trailed off, then looked up at Michael with sudden intensity. "Why did you help us that night? You didn't even know us." The question caught Michael off guard. Why had he stopped? He had walked past countless people in need during his anonymous excursions. What had made Elizabeth Foster different? "I'm not sure," he admitted finally. "Something about seeing your mother there alone in the cold I just couldn't walk past." Amy seemed to accept this answer. "Do you want to see her?" "She's not awake, but the nurses said talking to her might help." Michael hadn't expected this invitation, but he found himself nodding. Minutes later, he stood awkwardly beside a hospital bed, looking down at a woman he had seen only once before, huddled under an overpass. Elizabeth Foster appeared smaller than he remembered, diminished by illness and the clinical setting. Her blonde hair, the same shade as Amy's, spread across the pillow like a faded halo. Amy took her mother's hand with practiced gentleness. "Mom, that man I told you about came to visit. Remember? the one who gave you the blanket. Michael watched, feeling like an intruder in this intimate moment. Surprisingly, Elizabeth's eyes fluttered open. Confusion clouded her gaze for a moment before settling on her daughter. "Amy?" Her voice was barely a whisper. "I'm here, Mom," Amy replied, squeezing her hand. Elizabeth's gaze shifted, finding Michael. Recognition didn't immediately register, but she offered a weak smile. "You're Amy's friend." Something about the question, its simple acceptance, its lack of suspicion, touched Michael deeply. "Yes," he said, stepping closer to the bed. "My name is Michael." Elizabeth nodded slightly, as if this confirmed something important. "Thank you for helping my girl." The words were slurred with exhaustion and medication, but their meaning was clear. Before Michael could respond, Elizabeth's eyes drifted closed again. Amy adjusted the thin hospital blanket around her mother's shoulders with the expertise of someone who had been caring for others far too young. "The nurses say I can't stay overnight anymore. They caught me sleeping in the chair too many times," she explained matter-of-factly. "I have to go back to Hope House before dinner check." Michael frowned. "You've been coming here alone? Every day?" Amy nodded. "The city bus stop's right outside. I saved up enough from selling candy." A wave of something, shame, guilt, recognition of privilege, washed over Michael. While he had been living in isolation by choice, this child had been navigating an adult world of responsibility and care with no support. "I could drive you back to the shelter," he offered, "and maybe I could help with some things your mother might need here." Amy studied him, that same penetrating gaze that seemed to see past his carefully constructed exterior. "Why would you do that? You don't even know us." It was the second time she had asked him to explain his motives, and Michael found himself searching for an honest answer. "Because you recognized me," he said finally. "Not as who I am in my regular life, but you saw something in me that I haven't seen in myself for a very long time." Amy didn't ask what he meant by regular life or press him about his identity. Instead, she simply nodded, as if his answer made perfect sense. "Okay, but I need to stop at the gift shop first. They have these little stuffed bears and I've been saving to get one for Mom. The nurses said having something to hold might help when she gets confused." The simplicity of the request, a child wanting to bring comfort to her ailing mother with a small stuffed animal, contrasted sharply with the business decisions involving millions of dollars that Michael had made earlier that same day. As they walked to the elevator, Michael felt something shift within him. The invisible walls he had built around himself seemed suddenly transparent, revealing a man who had everything and nothing at the same time. In the hospital gift shop, as Amy carefully counted out crumpled dollar bills for a small teddy bear, Michael made a decision. He couldn't change Elizabeth Foster's medical condition. He couldn't erase years of hardship or rewrite Amy's childhood. But he could ensure that this child didn't face the coming days alone, and perhaps in helping her navigate her world, he might find his way back to something essential he had lost in his own. Later, after delivering the teddy bear to Elizabeth's room and driving Amy back to Hope House, Michael sat in his car watching as she disappeared through the shelter's doors. She had given him her mother's hospital room number and extracted a promise that he would visit again, a promise he intended to keep. For the first time in years, Michael Donovan had made a commitment, not because of business interests or obligation, but because of a genuine human connection. As he drove back to his empty penthouse, the city lights blurred around him. Something had awakened within him, something that had been dormant for so long he had forgotten its existence. The carefully constructed walls between Michael Donovan, billionaire recluse, and the world around him had begun to crumble. And surprisingly, he found himself welcoming their fall. For the next 2 weeks, Michael established a new routine. By day, he ran his company with renewed focus, surprising his executives with his sudden interest in the human resources department and employee assistance programs. By evening, he changed into his anonymous attire and visited Pennsylvania Memorial, often bringing Amy dinner before driving her back to Hope House. During these rides, he learned more about Amy and Elizabeth's life. Amy was 12, though her serious demeanor and watchful eyes made her seem older. She had attended 6 different schools as her mother moved them from place to place, seeking work and affordable housing. Despite this instability, Amy maintained impressive grades when she could attend classes regularly. She spoke of her mother with fierce loyalty and love. Elizabeth had always worked multiple jobs, Amy explained, until illness had made it impossible. She used to be a teacher before I was born, Amy told him one evening as they sat in the hospital cafeteria. She still has all these books she saved. That's the one thing she never sold, even when things got really bad. Michael had nodded, thinking of his own library in his penthouse. Books purchased for show rather than love, arranged by a decorator to complement his furniture. He hadn't read a novel for pleasure in years. On the 10th day of this new routine, Michael arrived at the hospital to find Amy in tears outside Elizabeth's room. A doctor was just leaving, his expression grave. "They said she's getting worse," Amy whispered when Michael reached her. "The infection spread. They're moving her to intensive care." Michael felt helpless in the face of her pain. In his normal life, problems were solved with money and influence. A phone call, a transfer of funds, and obstacles disappeared. But medical realities couldn't be negotiated away with even his considerable resources. Still, there were things he could do. While Amy sat with her mother before the transfer, Michael stepped away and made several calls. By that evening, Elizabeth Foster had been moved to a private room in the ICU with the hospital's top pulmonologist consulting on her case. Michael had arranged for additional nursing staff and ensured that Amy would be allowed liberal visiting hours, despite being under the typical age restrictions for ICU visitors. The hospital administrator had been surprised to receive a call directly from Michael Donovan, whose company, unbeknownst to Michael until that moment, had funded the hospital's new children's wing 2 years earlier. The following morning, Michael made another decision. After a brief meeting with his executive team, during which he delegated his immediate responsibilities, he drove to Hope House. The shelter was located in a converted school building in one of Philadelphia's struggling neighborhoods. The brick facade was weathered but clean, with children's artwork visible through ground floor windows. Michael hesitated in the parking lot, suddenly uncertain. In all his years of charitable giving, and Keystone Development had donated millions to various causes, he had never personally visited the organizations he supported. Charity had been handled through his foundation, managed by staff who selected worthy recipients and arranged the necessary publicity. Now dressed in his anonymous clothes, Michael approached the entrance, feeling strangely vulnerable. Inside, he was directed to the office of the shelter's director, Linda Pearson. A brisk, efficient woman in her 50s, she greeted him with polite curiosity. "You're Amy's friend," she said, recognition dawning as he introduced himself simply as Michael. "She mentioned you've been helping with hospital visits." Michael nodded, taking the seat she offered. "I wanted to discuss Amy's situation with you. Her mother's condition has worsened, and I'm concerned about Amy's well-being during this time." Linda's expression softened slightly. "We are too. Amy's a remarkable child, mature beyond her years. But this is a heavy burden for anyone, let alone a 12-year-old. She hesitated. "I should mention that we've contacted Child Protective Services, standard procedure when a minor's sole guardian is hospitalized long-term. They're working to locate any extended family members." The mention of Child Protective Services sent an unexpected jolt of alarm through Michael. "Has any family been found?" Linda shook her head. "Not yet. Elizabeth's records mention a sister in Ohio, but the contact information is outdated. If no family is located, Amy would likely enter the foster care system temporarily." The thought of Amy being placed with strangers while her mother fought for her life in the hospital was suddenly intolerable to Michael. Before he could fully consider the implications, he heard himself say, "I'd like to apply for temporary guardianship." Linda's eyebrows rose in surprise. "That's a significant commitment, Mr. Donovan," Michael supplied, making a split-second decision to reveal his full identity. Michael Donovan. Recognition flickered across Linda's face. Everyone in Philadelphia knew the Donovan name, even if few knew his face. "Mr. Donovan, while I appreciate your concern for Amy, temporary guardianship isn't something granted casually, especially to someone with no prior relationship to the family." "I understand," Michael replied, leaning forward in his chair. "But I've been spending time with Amy for the past 2 weeks. I've met her mother. I can provide stability and support during this difficult period and ensure Amy can visit her mother regularly." Linda studied him with the shrewd assessment of someone who had seen many well-intentioned but fleeting commitments. "May I ask why you're involved with this particular family?" There are many children here in similar situations. It was a fair question, one that Michael had been asking himself. Why Amy? Why Elizabeth? Out of all the people he had passed during his anonymous walks, what had drawn him to this particular mother and daughter? Amy recognized me, he said finally, the simplicity of the answer surprising even himself. Not as Michael Donovan, the businessman. She saw me as a person who had shown kindness to her mother, and in doing so, she helped me see myself clearly for the first time in years. Linda's expression remained neutral, though something in her eyes softened. That's a lovely sentiment, Mr. Donovan. But the foster system requires more practical considerations. Home inspections, background checks, character references. I understand, and I'm prepared to fulfill all requirements, Michael replied. I can also provide my attorney's contact information. He can facilitate the necessary paperwork. After further discussion, Linda agreed to contact the social worker assigned to Amy's case and arrange a preliminary meeting. As Michael left the shelter, he felt both terrified and exhilarated. What was he doing? Taking temporary guardianship of a child he barely knew? It was completely out of character, impulsive in a way he hadn't been since his youth, yet it also felt right in a way few decisions had in recent years. That evening, Michael visited Elizabeth in the ICU. Amy sat beside her mother's bed, reading aloud from a dog-eared paperback. She looked up when Michael entered, offering a tired smile. The nurse said reading might help, even if Mom can't respond right now, she explained. Michael nodded, taking the chair on the opposite side of the bed. What are you reading? To Kill a Mockingbird. It's Mom's favorite. She used to read it to her students every year. Something about the scene, this child reading a classic novel to her unconscious mother in a sterile hospital room, struck Michael deeply. Here was love in its purest form, undiminished by circumstance. After Amy finished the chapter, Michael gently broached the subject of temporary guardianship. While your mom is getting better, you'll need a place to stay, he began carefully. I spoke with Ms. Pearson at Hope House today about the possibility of you staying with me temporarily. Amy's expression was unreadable. Like foster care? Similar, but you'd stay with me specifically. I have plenty of room, and it would mean you could visit your mom whenever you wanted. He paused. But only if you're comfortable with the idea. Amy was quiet for a long moment, her gaze returning to her mother's face. Would I have to leave Hope House? My stuff is there, and my friends. We could get your things, Michael assured her, and you could still see your friends. This would just be temporary until your mum recovers. Another long pause. Where do you live? The question was innocent enough, but it highlighted the strange imbalance of their relationship. Amy knew him only as Michael, the kind stranger who had helped her mother. She had no idea of his wealth or position. I have an apartment downtown, he said, the understatement feeling necessary for now. There's a spare bedroom you could use. Amy seemed to be weighing something in her mind. Finally, she asked, why are you doing all this? You didn't even know us before. It was the third time she had asked some version of this question, and Michael still struggled to articulate an answer that made rational sense. How could he explain that her recognition of his simple act of kindness had cracked open something long dormant within him, that in her steady gaze he had glimpsed a version of himself he had forgotten existed? Sometimes people come into our lives unexpectedly, he said finally, and they change us in ways we couldn't have imagined. You and your mother have done that for me. Amy considered this, her expression serious beyond her years. Mom always said to trust your instincts about people, that your gut knows things your brain hasn't figured out yet. She looked at him directly. My gut says you're okay. Michael felt oddly moved by this simple endorsement. Thank you. That means a lot. But, Amy continued, I need to know who you really are. Not just Michael who visits the hospital. Who are you when you're not with us? The directness of the question caught Michael off guard. This child had an uncanny ability to cut through pretense. He took a deep breath. My full name is Michael Donovan. I own a company called Keystone Development Group. Recognition flickered in Amy's eyes. The buildings with the key symbol? The ones all over downtown? Michael nodded, surprised she had made the connection. Yes, that's my company. Amy absorbed this information with remarkable composure for a 12-year-old. So you're rich? It wasn't a question. I am, Michael acknowledged. Does that change things? Amy shook her head slowly. No, you're still the same person who helped Mom that night. Then, with the brutal honesty of childhood, she added, "But it explains why you always smell nice, even in those old clothes." The unexpected observation startled a laugh from Michael. A genuine laugh, something rare in recent years. The sound seemed to surprise them both. A nurse appeared at the door, signaling the end of visiting hours. As they prepared to leave, Amy placed her hand on her mother's arm and leaned close to her ear. "I'll be back tomorrow, Mom. I promise. Michael's going to help me find a place to stay. He's the man who gave you the blanket, remember? The one you said looked at you like a real person." The simple description, being seen as a real person, continued to resonate with Michael. As they walked through the hospital corridors, Amy's small hand found its way into his. The gesture of trust was unexpected and profoundly moving. For a man who had deliberately built walls between himself and genuine human connection, this child's willingness to reach out represented something precious and fragile. Whatever legal and practical hurdles lay ahead, Michael knew with sudden certainty that he was committed to this path. The carefully ordered isolation of his former life had been irrevocably disrupted, and he found himself grateful for the disruption. As they reached his car in the hospital parking lot, Amy looked up at the night sky, where a few stars were visible despite the city lights. "Mom says stars are like people," she remarked. "Some shine really bright and everyone notices them. Others are quieter, but they're still important. They're all part of the same sky." Michael followed her gaze upward. "Your mom sounds like a wise woman." "She is," Amy agreed. Then, with the resilience that continued to amaze him, she added, "And she's going to get better, I know it." Michael helped her into the car, hoping her certainty would prove justified. As he drove toward Hope House, for what might be Amy's last night there, he realized that regardless of Elizabeth Foster's medical outcome, his own life had already been irrevocably changed. The walls he had built so carefully over 15 years were crumbling, and through the cracks something long forgotten was beginning to shine through. The transition happened more quickly than Michael had anticipated. Within 3 days, thanks to his legal team's efficiency and his considerable influence, he had been granted temporary emergency guardianship of Amy Foster. The social worker assigned to the case, Mrs. Jenkins, had conducted an expedited home study of his penthouse apartment, raising her eyebrows at the minimalist luxury, but finding no grounds for objection. Background checks were completed, character references provided, and the necessary legal documents filed with remarkable speed. Throughout the process, Michael had been acutely aware of the advantages his wealth and connections provided, advantages that most people in Amy's situation would never have. This awareness brought with it an uncomfortable realization about the inequities of a system he had never before had reason to consider. On Thursday evening, Michael stood in the spare bedroom of his penthouse, surveying the space with new eyes. The room, previously used only for occasional overnight business associates, was impeccably decorated in tasteful neutrals. It suddenly seemed sterile and unwelcoming for a child. Impulsively, he called Rebecca. "I need your help with something personal," he said when his assistant answered. "My niece is coming to stay with me, and I need to make a bedroom more appropriate for a 12-year-old girl." The lie about Amy being his niece had become his standard explanation, simpler than the complicated truth. Rebecca, to her credit, adapted quickly to this unexpected request. "Of course, Mr. Donovan. Would you like me to contact an interior designer?" Michael considered this, then shook his head, though Rebecca couldn't see the gesture. "No, I was thinking perhaps you could help directly. You mentioned your daughter is a bit younger, but you might have better instincts about this than I do." The silence on the other end of the line suggested Rebecca was processing this unprecedented request. In 7 years, Michael had never asked for her input on anything personal. "I'd be happy to help," she said finally. "When would you like me to come by? Could you meet me at the department store on Market Street in an hour? We can select some items together." Another brief silence. "Of course, sir. I'll see you there." 2 hours later, Michael's car was filled with bags containing bedding with constellations printed on deep blue fabric. "Amy likes stars," he had explained. A desk lamp shaped like a moon, bookshelves, and various other items Rebecca had suggested might make a 12-year-old feel at home. They had also stopped at a bookstore, where Michael had purchased an assortment of age-appropriate books, including several Rebecca recommended from her daughter's collection. As they unloaded the purchases at his building, Rebecca asked tentatively, "May I ask about your niece, Mr. Donovan? I wasn't aware you had siblings." Michael hesitated, then decided on a partial truth. "Amy isn't actually my niece. She's the daughter of someone important to me. Her mother is seriously ill and Amy needed a place to stay temporarily." Rebecca nodded, accepting this explanation without further questions. As they arranged the new items in the bedroom, transforming the space from corporate guest room to something more suitable for a child, Michael found himself sharing more details about Amy, her intelligence, her resilience, her devotion to her mother. "She's had a difficult life," he concluded, as they hung star-shaped fairy lights around the bed. "I want to make this transition as comfortable as possible for her." Rebecca smiled, a genuine expression that reminded Michael of her reaction when he had asked about her daughter. "It sounds like you care for her very much already." The observation gave Michael pause. Did he care for Amy? The speed and intensity of his involvement with her and Elizabeth certainly suggested so. In just weeks, they had become more important to him than people he had known for years. "I suppose I do," he admitted, surprising himself with the acknowledgement. By evening, the room was transformed. After Rebecca left, Michael stood in the doorway, hoping Amy would feel welcome in this unfamiliar space. He picked her up from Hope House the following afternoon. Her belongings fit into 2 small bags: clothes, a few books, and personal items. The sparseness of her possessions was another stark reminder of the difference between their worlds. As they rode the private elevator to the penthouse, Amy's eyes widened. "You live at the very top." Michael nodded, suddenly self-conscious about the opulence she was about to witness. "It's just an apartment. A bit bigger than most, perhaps." This understatement became apparent as the elevator doors opened directly into his foyer, revealing the expansive living area beyond, with its floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Philadelphia skyline. Amy stepped out cautiously, taking in the space with unreadable expression. "This is all yours?" "Yes," Michael answered, watching her reaction carefully. "Just me until now." Amy walked slowly to the windows, pressing her palm against the glass as she looked out at the city spread below them. "You can see everything from here." There was something in her tone, not envy or awe, but a kind of thoughtful assessment that made Michael see his home through new eyes. The pristine surfaces, the curated artwork, the designer furniture arranged for aesthetic rather than comfort. It all suddenly seemed hollow, a stage set rather than a home. "Would you like to see your room?" he asked, picking up her bags. Amy followed him down the hallway to the transformed guest room. When he opened the door, she froze in the doorway, her eyes moving from the constellation bedding to the starlights, to the bookshelves now filled with novels, science books, and art supplies. "You did all this for me?" Her voice was small, uncertain. "I had some help," Michael admitted. "My assistant, Rebecca, helped me pick things out. I wasn't sure what you might like, but she has a daughter, a bit younger than you." Amy stepped into the room, touching the bedspread, the desk lamp, the books, with cautious fingers. "It's beautiful," she said finally. "Thank you." She turned to face him, her expression serious. "But you know this is just temporary, right? Until Mom gets better." The hope in her voice was palpable, and Michael felt a twinge of concern. Elizabeth's condition remained critical, with doctors still uncertain about her prognosis. "Of course," he assured her. "This is just until your mom comes home." The lie felt necessary, a kindness rather than a deception. Over the next few days, they established a routine. Michael arranged for a car service to take Amy to school each morning while he went to his office. In the afternoons, his driver would pick Amy up and bring her to the hospital to visit Elizabeth. Michael would meet them there after work, and they would have dinner together in the hospital cafeteria or a nearby restaurant before returning to the penthouse. The arrangement was working better than Michael had anticipated, though he was acutely aware of how strange it must seem to others. This solitary businessman suddenly accompanied by a solemn 12-year-old girl. His employees had been discreetly curious, especially when he began leaving the office promptly at 5 each day, something unprecedented in his workaholic history. On the 7th day of this new arrangement, Michael arrived at the hospital to find Amy in animated conversation with her social worker, Mrs. Jenkins, outside Elizabeth's room. "Michael," Amy called when she saw him. "Mrs. Jenkins found my Aunt Jean. She lives in Columbus, Ohio now. Michael felt an unexpected sinking sensation. Your mother's sister? Mrs. Jenkins nodded, extending her hand. Mr. Donovan, good to see you. Yes, we've located Jean Harper, Elizabeth's younger sister. We spoke by phone this afternoon. Michael shook her hand automatically, his mind racing. Of course, finding Amy's family was a positive development. He had known his guardianship was temporary. Still, the news landed like a stone in his stomach. That's wonderful, he managed. Will she be coming to Philadelphia? She's making arrangements now, Mrs. Jenkins confirmed. She should arrive within the next few days. She was quite surprised to learn about Elizabeth's condition. Apparently, they lost touch several years ago after a family disagreement. Amy's expression was a complex mixture of emotions: hope at the prospect of reconnecting with family, uncertainty about this unknown aunt, and something else Michael couldn't quite identify. Can I still stay with you until she gets here? She asked him. Of course, Michael assured her quickly. Nothing changes for now. After Mrs. Jenkins left, they visited Elizabeth together. There had been no significant change in her condition, though the doctors reported small improvements in her respiratory function. Amy, as always, spoke to her mother as if she could hear every word, sharing details about school, her new room at Michael's apartment, and the news about Aunt Jean. She's coming to see you, Mom, Amy said, holding her mother's hand. Remember how you always said she'd come around eventually? You were right. Later, as they drove home in silence, Michael struggled to identify the emotions churning within him. He should be happy that Amy had family coming to support her. This was the best possible outcome, far better than foster care with strangers. Yet the prospect of Amy leaving filled him with a profound sense of loss. In just a few short weeks, she had become an essential part of his life, breaking through years of carefully constructed isolation. The thought of returning to his previous existence suddenly seemed unbearable. As if sensing his thoughts, Amy spoke up from the passenger seat. I looked up your company online yesterday. Michael glanced at her, surprised by the change of subject. Did you? Keystone Development owns a lot of buildings in Philadelphia, and in New York and Boston too. Michael nodded. Yes, we've expanded over the years. The article said you never give interviews, and there weren't many pictures of you, just old ones. Her observations were accurate. Michael had deliberately maintained a low public profile, especially after the media frenzy that had followed his early success. I prefer my privacy, he explained. Amy considered this. Is that why you walk around in those regular clothes, so people don't recognize you? Again, her perception startled him. Partly, yes. It allows me to move through the city without being noticed. But why do you want to be invisible? The question, so direct and fundamental, caught Michael off guard. Why indeed? The answer had seemed obvious to him for so long that he had stopped questioning it. Now faced with Amy's simple inquiry, he found himself searching for an explanation that would make sense. I suppose, he said slowly, it started as a way to protect myself. When you have money and success, people sometimes want things from you rather than wanting to know you. Amy nodded thoughtfully. Like those fake friends who only like you because you have the newest phone or the coolest shoes. Exactly like that, just on a larger scale. Michael smiled slightly at her comparison. But then it became a habit, I think, a way of keeping everyone at a distance. Even people who might actually like you, the real you. Another penetrating question from this remarkably perceptive child. Yes, even them. Especially them, perhaps. They had reached the penthouse building, and Michael handed his keys to the valet. As they rode the elevator up, Amy was quiet, seemingly processing their conversation. Just before the doors opened, she said, I think that's really sad. The simple assessment hit Michael with unexpected force. Sad. Yes, it was sad. This deliberate isolation he had created, this empty luxury he had surrounded himself with, devoid of genuine connection. The realization sat heavily between them as they entered the apartment. Later that evening, as Michael prepared dinner, another new routine, he had started cooking simple meals rather than ordering in, discovering an unexpected enjoyment in the process. Amy sat at the kitchen counter doing homework. Michael, she asked, looking up from her math problems, what happens if my aunt doesn't want me to stay with her? The question revealed a vulnerability Amy rarely displayed. I'm sure she'll want you, Michael replied gently. You're her niece. But she's never even met me. Mom said they stopped talking before I was born. Amy traced patterns on her notebook with her finger. What if she only takes me because she has to? The fear behind the question was clear. The fear of being unwanted, a burden rather than a choice. It resonated with something deep within Michael, some long-buried insecurity from his own childhood. "Amy," he said, setting down the spatula and giving her his full attention, "anyone who gets to know you would be lucky to have you in their life. I've known you for less than a month and already you've changed mine completely." The words came out with an emotional honesty that surprised him. Amy looked up, her eyes searching his face. "Really? Really?" he confirmed. "In fact," he hesitated, then plunged ahead. "If for any reason things don't work out with your aunt, I want you to know that you would always have a place here with me." The offer, unplanned but deeply sincere, hung in the air between them. Amy's expression softened. "Even after Mom gets better?" "Even then," Michael assured her. "This apartment has been just a place to sleep for too long." "You've made it feel more like a home in just a week." Amy smiled, a full, genuine smile that transformed her serious face into that of the child she still was beneath her mature demeanor. "I like it here too," she admitted. "And I think Mom would like it." She paused, then added with characteristic directness, "She always wanted a real home for us." The simple statement carried years of struggle within it, the transient existence that had been Amy's childhood, moving from temporary shelter to temporary housing, never having stability or permanence. It also carried a weight of responsibility that no child should have to bear. In that moment, Michael made a decision, one that had been forming in his mind since the day Amy had recognized him on the street, but that he hadn't fully acknowledged until now. Whatever happened with Elizabeth's recovery, whatever arrangements were made with Amy's aunt, he would ensure that Amy and her mother never again had to worry about having a safe, permanent home. It was the least he could do for the child who had seen him, truly seen him, when he had been invisible for so long. As they sat down to dinner, Michael felt something he hadn't experienced in years. The sensation of being exactly where he was meant to be, in the company of someone who mattered deeply. The walls he had built around his heart continued to crumble, and he found himself welcoming their collapse with each passing day. Jean Harper arrived in Philadelphia on a rainy Tuesday afternoon, 3 weeks after Michael had taken temporary guardianship of Amy. He and Amy waited in the hospital lobby, both uncharacteristically nervous, when a woman with the same blonde hair as Elizabeth entered. Looking around uncertainly, Amy tensed beside him. "That's her," she whispered. "I recognize her from Mom's old pictures." Michael placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder as Jean approached. She was younger than Elizabeth, probably in her early 30s, with the same delicate features as her sister, though lacking the weathered quality that years of hardship had etched onto Elizabeth's face. "Amy?" she asked tentatively. Amy nodded, stepping forward with the quiet dignity that continued to impress Michael. "Hi, Aunt Jean." Jean's eyes filled with tears as she looked at her niece. "You look so much like your mother when she was young." She turned to Michael with a questioning expression. "And you must be Mr. Donovan. The social worker told me about your help. Thank you for taking care of Amy." Michael shook her hand, studying her face for any resemblance to the woman lying unconscious several floors above them. "It's been my privilege," he said simply. "Amy is an extraordinary young person." The three of them made their way to Elizabeth's room, an awkward trio bound together by their connection to the silent figure in the hospital bed. Jean gasped softly when she saw her sister, rushing to the bedside. "Oh, Lizzie," she whispered, taking Elizabeth's hand. "I'm so sorry. I should have tried harder to find you." The naked emotion in her voice spoke of genuine regret. Whatever disagreement had separated the sisters seemed insignificant now in the face of Elizabeth's condition. As Jean spoke softly to her unconscious sister, Michael and Amy stepped into the hallway to give her privacy. "She seems nice," Michael offered, watching Amy's face carefully. Amy nodded, her expression thoughtful. "She looks a lot like Mom." And she cried when she saw her. The observation seemed important to Amy, evidence that her aunt truly cared for her mother despite their estrangement. Michael had arranged for Jean to stay at a hotel near the hospital, and after an emotional visit with Elizabeth, he drove them there. Over dinner in the hotel restaurant, Jean shared more about herself. She was a high school English teacher in Columbus, divorced with no children of her own. The estrangement from Elizabeth had begun over a boyfriend Jean had disapproved of. Amy's father, who had abandoned Elizabeth when she was pregnant. I told her he was bad news, Jean explained, her expression regretful. I was right. But that didn't help Lizzie. We both said terrible things and then she moved away. I tried to find her a few times over the years, but she never stayed in one place long enough. She looked at Amy with genuine affection. I had no idea I had a niece until the social worker called. I've missed so much of your life. Amy, who had been quiet throughout dinner, finally asked the question that had clearly been weighing on her. Will I have to go live with you in Ohio? Jean glanced at Michael, then back to Amy. Well, we have a lot to figure out. Right now, the most important thing is your mom's recovery. The doctors said there's been some improvement? Michael nodded. Small but consistent progress over the past week. They're cautiously optimistic. That's good news, Jean said, reaching across the table to squeeze Amy's hand. Let's focus on that for now. There's no rush to make decisions about the future until we see how Lizzie recovers. Her response was diplomatic, but Michael could see the questions in her eyes. What exactly was his relationship to Amy and Elizabeth? Why had a billionaire businessman taken such personal interest in their situation? Over the next few days, Jean integrated herself into the hospital routine, spending long hours at Elizabeth's bedside while Amy attended school. Michael continued to include both Amy and Jean in his evenings, often bringing dinner to the hospital or taking them to restaurants nearby. During these shared meals, he observed the growing connection between aunt and niece, feeling both happy for Amy and increasingly concerned about what it might mean for his own relationship with her. On Friday afternoon, a week after Jean's arrival, Michael received an unexpected call from Elizabeth's doctor. Mr. Donovan, there's been a significant change in Ms. Foster's condition. Could you come to the hospital as soon as possible? We've already contacted her sister. Michael's heart raced as he ended the call. The doctor's careful neutrality gave no indication whether the news was positive or negative. He cancelled his remaining meetings and drove to the hospital with a sense of foreboding. Had all the specialized care and expert consultations been for nothing? How would Amy handle losing her mother after maintaining such steadfast hope for her recovery? When he arrived at the ICU, he found John in the hallway outside Elizabeth's room, her face wet with tears. His stomach dropped. John? What's happened? To his surprise, she smiled through her tears. She's awake, Michael. Lizzie's awake and she's talking. The doctors say she's turned the corner. Relief flooded through him. That's wonderful news. Where's Amy? Still at school. I've called the car service to bring her directly here. Jean wiped her eyes. Elizabeth's been asking for her. She hesitated. And for you, actually. She remembers you from that night under the overpass. And apparently Amy's told her all about you during her visits. Michael felt a surge of emotion at the thought that Elizabeth had heard and remembered Amy's stories during her unconsciousness. Can I see her? Jean nodded, gesturing toward the door. She's tired and weak but lucid. The doctors are amazed at her improvement. Michael entered the room cautiously. Elizabeth Foster looked dramatically different from his previous visits. Her eyes open, some color returned to her face, the breathing tube removed. She turned her head slightly as he approached. Michael Donovan, she said, her voice raspy from weeks of intubation. Amy's guardian angel. Michael felt his face warm at the description. Hardly that. Just someone who's been fortunate enough to get to know your remarkable daughter. Elizabeth studied him with eyes that reminded him strongly of Amy's, the same direct, assessing gaze. Jean told me what you've done. Taking Amy in, the medical care, everything. She paused, drawing a careful breath. Why would you do all that for strangers? It was the same question Amy had asked him repeatedly, and Michael found himself giving a similar answer. Because your daughter saw me, really saw me, when I'd been invisible for a very long time, even to myself. Elizabeth's expression softened. Amy has always had that gift, seeing people for who they really are. She reached out a weak hand which Michael carefully took. Thank you for giving her stability when I couldn't. The simple gratitude in her voice moved him deeply. It's been my privilege, he said for the second time that week, realizing how genuinely he meant it. Amy arrived 30 minutes later, rushing into the room with uncharacteristic abandon. The reunion between mother and daughter was a moment of pure joy that brought tears to everyone's eyes. As Michael and Jean stepped into the hallway to give them privacy, Jean turned to him with a serious expression. I need to ask you something, and I hope you'll be honest with me." Michael nodded, bracing himself. "Of course. What are your intentions regarding Amy and Elizabeth?" The question was direct but not accusatory. "I'm not sure I understand," Michael replied cautiously. Jean sighed. "Look, it's obvious you care about them both. What I'm trying to understand is what happens next. Are you planning to remain in their lives? Because Amy has clearly become very attached to you, and I'm concerned about what another disruption might do to her." The question made Michael realize he hadn't fully articulated his own intentions, even to himself. What did he want? What role did he envision in Amy and Elizabeth's future? "I would like to remain in their lives, yes," he said finally. "In whatever capacity they're comfortable with. Amy has..." He searched for the right words. "Amy has changed me in ways I'm still discovering. She broke through walls I built around myself years ago." Jean studied him for a long moment. "You know, when the social worker first told me that Michael Donovan had taken temporary guardianship of my niece, I assumed it was some kind of publicity stunt or tax write-off." She shook her head. "I was prepared to dislike you on principle. But seeing you with Amy, hearing how she talks about you, it's obvious this is something else entirely." Before Michael could respond, Amy appeared in the doorway, her face radiant with happiness. "Mom wants to see you both," she announced. The next hour passed in quiet conversation around Elizabeth's bed. Though still weak, she was fully alert, asking questions about Amy's school, listening to stories about her time at Michael's apartment, and reconnecting with her sister after years of separation. As the evening progressed, the inevitable question of future arrangements arose. "The doctors say I'll need extensive rehabilitation," Elizabeth explained. "Weeks, possibly months of recovery before I can work again." She looked at Jean. "I'm not sure what options we have." "You'll both come to Columbus with me," Jean said immediately. "I have plenty of room in my house, and there are excellent rehabilitation facilities there." Michael felt a pang at the thought of Amy moving to Ohio, but he kept his expression neutral. This was what should happen, family reuniting, supporting one another. Jean continued, addressing both Elizabeth and Amy. "It won't be easy. I work full-time, and rehabilitation is a long process, but we're family. We'll figure it out together." Elizabeth squeezed her sister's hand gratefully, but her eyes moved to Michael. "And what about you? Will you go back to being invisible once we leave?" The question was gentle but direct, cutting to the heart of what Michael had been avoiding thinking about. Before he could formulate a response, Amy spoke up. "He doesn't have to," she said, with characteristic directness. "He could visit us in Columbus. Or we could visit him here sometimes." The solution, so simple in a child's mind, brought a smile to Michael's face. "I'd like that very much," he said honestly. Then, gathering his courage, he added, "But I'd also like to suggest another possibility." 3 sets of eyes turned to him expectantly. "I own several properties in Philadelphia, including a residential building near the hospital. There are 2 vacant apartments, one on the ground floor that would be ideal for someone with mobility issues during rehabilitation, and another directly above it." He looked at Elizabeth. "They could be yours, for as long as you need them. The ground floor unit is already adapted for accessibility." Elizabeth's eyes widened. "Michael, that's incredibly generous, but..." "It's not charity," he interrupted gently. "It's an investment in people who matter to me." He glanced at Amy, whose expression was cautiously hopeful. "It would mean Amy wouldn't have to change schools, and you'd have access to the specialists who are already familiar with your case." Jean looked between her sister and Michael, her expression thoughtful. "It's a significant offer, Lizzie, and it would mean I could visit often without having to uproot you both." Elizabeth seemed overwhelmed by the suggestion. "I don't know what to say." "Say you'll consider it," Michael replied. "There's no rush to decide. You have a long recovery ahead, and Jean is right. Family should be together during that time." He paused. "I just want you to know you have options." The conversation shifted to other topics, but Michael could see Elizabeth and John exchanging meaningful glances, silently communicating in the way only siblings can. Later, as visiting hours ended, Michael prepared to leave with a promise to return the following day. Amy walked him to the elevator, unusually quiet. "Are you okay?" he asked as they waited. She nodded, then surprised him by wrapping her arms around his waist in a tight hug. "Thank you," she said, her voice muffled against his jacket. "For everything." Michael returned the embrace, a lump forming in his throat. "You don't need to thank me, Amy." She looked up at him, her expression serious. "Mom's going to say yes to the apartments. I can tell." "Oh?" Michael raised an eyebrow. "And how do you know that?" "Because she wants to stay near you too," Amy said with the straightforward certainty of a child who sees what adults often miss. "She said you're the first person who's ever helped us without wanting something back." The simple assessment hit Michael with unexpected force. How often in his business dealings had every interaction been transactional, every relationship defined by mutual benefit rather than genuine connection? Amy's recognition of him, first on the street, then as a person behind the wealth and position, had been the purest form of seeing he had experienced in years. The elevator arrived, but Michael hesitated. "Amy, I want you to know something. Whatever happens, whether you move to Columbus or stay in Philadelphia, you've changed my life. For the better." Amy smiled, a bright expression that transformed her serious face. "I know," she said, with endearing confidence. "You're not invisible anymore." 3 months later, Michael stood in the doorway of a bright apartment on the ground floor of a renovated brownstone in Philadelphia's Rittenhouse Square neighborhood. Elizabeth Foster sat at a dining table, grading papers. Her recovery had progressed remarkably well, and she had recently accepted a part-time position teaching English at a nearby community college. "How was the board meeting?" she asked, looking up with a smile. Michael loosened his tie as he entered. "Productive. They approved the new affordable housing initiative." The initiative had been his passion project for the past months, a commitment to convert several Keystone properties into mixed-income housing, with units specifically designated for families transitioning from homelessness. The idea had been met with initial resistance from some board members, but Michael's newfound willingness to use his public profile to champion the cause had eventually won approval. "Amy will be thrilled." "Where is she?" "Upstairs with Jean, planning their weekend in Columbus." Jean had returned to Ohio after Elizabeth's release from the hospital, but visited regularly. The sisters had repaired their relationship during Elizabeth's recovery, finding their way back to the closeness they had shared in childhood. "I thought we might all have dinner together," Michael suggested, "to celebrate the board's approval." Elizabeth nodded, setting aside her papers. Amy mentioned wanting to try that new Thai place around the corner. As if summoned by her name, Amy bounded into the apartment, followed by her aunt. "Michael, did they say yes to your housing project?" His relationship with Amy had evolved over the months, settling into a comfortable pattern of shared meals, weekend outings, and homework help. She still had the uncanny ability to see through his corporate persona to the person beneath, but now that person was far less hidden than before. "They did," he confirmed, unable to suppress a smile at her enthusiasm. "Told you they would," Amy exclaimed, giving him a quick hug before turning to her mother. "Can we go celebrate?" Michael promised to tell me all about how they're going to choose the families. The transformation in Amy was as remarkable as her mother's recovery. The solemn, too mature child he had first met had gradually given way to a more typical 12-year-old, though she retained the perceptiveness and compassion that had drawn him to her initially. As they left the apartment together, Michael, Elizabeth, Amy, and Jean, for a celebratory dinner, Michael reflected on the strange journey that had brought them to this point. A chance encounter on a cold night, a simple act of kindness, a child's recognition of humanity beneath a carefully crafted disguise. His life had been irrevocably changed, not by grand gestures or business achievements, but by being truly seen. Later that evening, after Jean had returned to Elizabeth's apartment and Amy had gone upstairs to finish homework, Michael and Elizabeth sat in the small garden behind the brownstone. The spring air was mild, filled with the scent of newly planted flowers that Elizabeth had carefully selected. "I was thinking about something today," Elizabeth said, breaking a comfortable silence. "Do you remember what Amy told you I said about you? After that night under the overpass?" Michael nodded. "That I looked at you like you were still a person?" "Yes," Elizabeth smiled softly. "I've been thinking about what a gift that is, to be seen as fully human regardless of circumstance. It's something most people take for granted until they lose it." She turned to face him directly. "But I think Amy did the same thing for you, didn't she? She saw you. Not your wealth or position, just you." The observation was characteristic of Elizabeth, perceptive, gently stated, but cutting straight to the heart of things. She did, Michael acknowledged. I had spent so long hiding behind walls of my own making that I'd forgotten what it felt like to be recognized for something other than my success or resources. And now? Elizabeth prompted. Michael considered the question. Now I'm learning to live without those walls. It's not always comfortable. Growth rarely is, Elizabeth interjected with a smile. But it's infinitely more fulfilling, he finished. I spent 15 years accumulating wealth and influence while becoming increasingly isolated from genuine connection. One small act of kindness, witnessed by a child who hadn't yet learned to look away from those society deems invisible, changed everything. Elizabeth reached over and squeezed his hand, a gesture of understanding and affection that had become familiar between them. Sometimes, she said softly, we need to be seen before we can learn to see ourselves clearly. As the evening deepened around them, Michael reflected on the truth of her words. The carefully constructed isolation that had defined his existence for so long had been irreparably broken. First by Amy's recognition, then by his own willingness to be vulnerable, to reach out, to remain visible, even when it would have been easier to retreat behind familiar walls. In helping Amy and Elizabeth, he had received a gift far greater than anything his wealth could have purchased. The restoration of his own humanity, reflected back to him through the eyes of those who saw him not for what he possessed, but for who he truly was. Sometimes, he said, echoing Elizabeth's words, a single moment of being truly seen can change everything. And in the quiet garden, surrounded by new growth and possibility, Michael Donovan, once the invisible billionaire, now simply a man reconnected to the world around him, felt a profound gratitude for the child who had looked at him and declared with certainty, "I know you." In that recognition, he had found his way home.